honoured to be here in Wolverhampton today and be in conversation with someone whose work I've been admiring for a very long time, and be able to have the opportunity to think through a long career, and a career that sort of spans so many different approaches and ways of working and processes, and I'm going to try and ask some questions about that. Currently I'm working on a book where I have the privilege of having you and your colleagues write a text. And I was very struck by a line you wrote, where you wrote, "Absence is not emptiness. The bodies are gone, but the violence remains." And it really resonated with me at that point because of looking at your work again and again, looking at the books, and it made me think that your practice is not just about what's missing, but also about what's lingering, what remains, even if it's the most mundane or the barely see, you can barely see things, or their traces. And I often sort of think about the ways in which your pictures absorb that life, that human life. And I wanted to invite you to say more about that sentence you wrote a few weeks or months ago about absence is not emptiness, and what remains. I feel like it's the sort of core of your practice in many ways. Would you agree with that statement?
First of all, thank you everyone for coming, and good afternoon. I do agree, it's something that for me, absence, it's never empty, it's always filled. So there is, we think it's emptiness, but it's always something is filled up with something that stays with us, or we live with that emptiness. And when it comes to violence, or it comes like there is pain in filled up with, I think that's even more. It has a more presence in that absence, let's say. And it's something that in most of my works, this is like the core practice or the concept that I always try to lean on and bring it always in my work. So in that sense, yes, I do agree.
Whilst I was thinking about the ways in which we can approach together this afternoon your practice, I was also fascinated to read more about the beginnings. So I wanted us to maybe go back in time a little bit. Your early experience with photography started with your father's photo studio, right? Dream Color?
Correct, Dream Color, yes.
In Damascus, where he would probably have a business of taking portraits of people.
Yeah, so my father, before Dream Color, was actually the lab. He opened in 1976, and that was the first color lab in Syria. But before that, I was not born yet. But he was a photographer where he took photographed social events, embassy meetings, exhibition openings, or commercial fairs, these kind of things. And in some point in his career, because he also wanted to become an artist, he wanted to be art photographer, but he realized that he would never be able to put bread on the table. And for our relationship, this was the core thing between me and my father, that we had a very big fight at some stage later on. But I grew up in this lab where he was constantly there from 9 to 10 in the evening, and in summer holidays we didn't travel anywhere. I went to work with my father, and I loved it. I mean, it's basically where I learned everything about photography, and also about life and how to talk with people, all these other things that are not related to photography, but it's more about daily life and manners and all these things. because the lab was not also small. There were 15 employees, and so it's for me it was, I spent more time in this place than at home.
So you obviously learned how to create, make, take pictures, but I guess you also learned something about photography. How do you feel it sort of maybe trained your eye or trained your way of thinking about images in that way?
It's definitely, it was, I think for me, that's the place where I train my eye to look at things. And it's also the place where I learned I have this phobia from not having straight lines in my images. Then it's something I know that I got it from my father, because he hated when images are not in perspective, and so I inherited that from him, and it did help, yes. I mean. And
am I right to say that sort of there was an important encounter while you were in Damascus of a photographer called Sophie Rissalbuer, and in a way impacted the way in which you maybe shifted your understanding of photography and shifted your career and what you would end up by doing?
Yes.
Can you tell us this anecdote?
Yeah, it is, but it's also, I mean, I told Sophie 2 years ago when I met her, and I reminded her that in Damascus, we also, back then there were no internet, and we had only, for instance, like libraries where the most, like the latest contemporary photographer, let's say, it's Henri Cartier-Bresson, or this kind of for me, it's like classical photographers. So I didn't know there were other photographers who would, for instance, photograph spoons or forks or nails. This with the concept, I didn't know that this thing exists. And I did many kind of not apprenticeship. I was not assistant as well. Like I traveled with Sophie Rissalbuer, for instance, when she traveled around in Syria, and other French photographers, because I was because of the French Cultural Center in Damascus. And when I traveled with Sophie on the way back, she said, "Hrair, you should leave your father and go and do photography." And for me, this was really a big shock, because how can I leave my father? It was literally a slap in my face. I would never do that. But gradually, with time, this thing just grew up in me and inside me, and I really wanted to be a photographer. And that's where also my conflict with my father started, because I was supposed to take care of the family business. And at some point, 2005, I think, I just quit.
And so what happened after?
Well, my father didn't talk to me for 3 years. So that was quite a very difficult moment for me. I still remember, but things later, I mean, we sorted out everything, but it's these times that really makes me really sad if I go look back at it now. But at the same time, I'm very happy that I've done this. I took this decision and to leave and do what I wanted to do. So yeah.
And you went to Europe to train?
I went, yeah. I mean, not to train, because I was trained, but it's more to see more, to have access more to other things that were going around, because we didn't have this opportunity. And Syria was quite enclosed country, so we didn't have exhibitions coming or whatever. It's mainly we had this artist who would come to do like a project in Syria, and then we would encounter them and get as much as we could from them as well.
I like what you said about you didn't know that there were artists taking pictures of spoons or forks, because I guess you became an artist who anchors their work in concept and in research. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time about your sort of research-driven practice and how you sort of typically engage with a new project, which is first and foremost sort of a research process, and then it becomes a visual sort of material project. Could you sort of talk to us a little bit about this process, this sort of, how does it start, how do you find a new idea, and then how do you make you read about it or engage with it, and then how does the research lead you into a sort of a form, an idea that for a specific project?
I think it's different from project to project, but I mean, I either come across topics or subjects by just reading the newspaper, or sometimes, for instance, the project I did here, the last scene, which were like last wishes of terminally ill people in the Netherlands. I just saw a post, like an article written in Dutch on Facebook, and I just Googled it and found this organization who would fulfill these last wishes. And then I started doing the research, contacted the organization. They never replied because I wrote in English. It took me a year, and then I found a person who would be the contact link between me and them, and they were very happy to help me, and it was really like an amazing experience I had with them. And some other projects, for instance, Sea of Trees, doing research about people who would disappear in Japan, and then I come across this forest where, and I started to dig more. And that's when I decided I want to go to the forest, and there is always this like a capacity where I just reached into a point where that's it for me. I don't need to do more research. I just want to go and do the work, like take pictures or sound recording or whatever it is.
So the research practice is both some sort of reading and engagement with a topic. So I wanted to ask you about archives and your sort of engagement with archives, but I also wanted to ask you a question about collaboration, because you say you reach out to people and then people become sort of fixers in a way. How do you sort of navigate that?
I usually don't work with other people. I mean, all my projects I do it by myself, but some places, for instance, a work I did about people who were kidnapped or arrested, I had to go through NGOs because I've done it in 5 different countries, and I only spoke when I did it in Lebanon, for instance. I speak Arabic, so that was very easy to communicate with the families. But when I went to Bosnia, Kosovo, Brazil, Argentina, I didn't speak the language, and neither they did speak English. So there's this communication thing. I had to rely on someone else. And these NGO organizations, they are always the key to open doors to these families. Otherwise, nobody would just say, please welcome and come and do whatever you want. So I had to go through them. It's always a way of, it ends different way, each project, how I would proceed.
And how do you know, you said, okay, there's a moment where I'm like, okay, I'm ready to go to making the pictures. Is it a feeling? Is it a hunch? Is it a...
It's a feeling, but at the same time, I know exactly how the outcome is going to be. So for me...
You have the images in your head.
Exactly. The images, and even sometimes the way I want to install the work. For instance, the Sea of Trees here, I knew how I was going to install the work.
With the red ribbon?
With the red ribbon, from the beginning. I even had this, like a maquette on my desk at the studio. I had it for 2 years, and I'm very happy to see the work now installed here in real, which is very good to see that. So I mean that's the way it works.
That's incredible. So can you maybe for maybe some of you have seen the show already? Can you tell us about the process of the ribbon, like the actual reality of it, and then how you sort of transferred it into your sort of installation here in Wolverhampton? So
in the forest is it's when people decide to end their lives in the forest because Aokigahara forest it's a very dense and volcanic forest. So people, if when they go in, they will definitely get lost. There is no way to get out of the forest very easily because it's a very dense forest. Phone not always work, and even the compass doesn't work. So what they do is they tie a ribbon at the beginning of the forest before they go deeper inside, and they drag the ribbon all the way along until they reach the the point where they decide to end their lives. And the reason they use the ribbon is, one, while going to the destination, they might change their mind, so they would follow the ribbon to get out of the forest. And the second reason is, if they do not succeed with the whole process, they would also follow the ribbon to get out of the forest. They don't necessarily use red ribbon, usually it's plastic ribbon. And this is the way also how the forest rangers found people, the remains of people in the forest sometimes. They would just follow the ribbon, and they would, because if not, if there is no ribbon, there won't be a way to find them. And the other significance of this ribbon is in Eastern culture there is something called the myth of red ribbon, which is basically when someone is born, God ties the one end of the ribbon on the thumb, and the other end is later when they find their soulmate, they would tie it on the pinky. This is in Japanese, but with Chinese they do it on the ankle, and it's different, but it's always this red ribbon that is that makes this connection. And I use the red ribbon here to make this connection between life and death at each end of the ribbon.
I was going to sort of say, whilst you were talking about the ribbons, it feels almost like a bedtime story, the ribbon, you know, even if obviously the subject is quite dramatic. But it leads me to my sort of other question about this sort of capacity for your work to address the most sort of taboo subject of societies, and yet invite your viewer or the visitor to sit with it and engage with it, maybe even more widely for all your projects, because it applies to most of your projects. This sort of, how do you negotiate this sort of taboo versus representation, and where do you stand there?
I mean, in the case of the forest here in Japanese culture, I think committing suicide, it's not a taboo. They don't consider it as a taboo. It's historically also, it's something existed already. And I mean, for me, the idea of this project, it's going to the forest and experience the space. And because I've seen so many videos, for instance, and so many photographs, but I wanted to go there and see and feel also. It's a nature reserve place in Japan, and it's very highly protected. So you would never come across any plastic wrappings or plastic bottles, whatever.
Oh, sorry, my daughter's husband's been there, and he said that there's a certain smell. Did you actually feel that sense of the spirits and the smell around you while you were working there?
I'll come to the spirits, but the smell, I didn't smell anything, no.
So that sulfur from the volcanic rock,
There could be, but I didn't. Maybe it depends on the season.
Time of the year.
Yeah, because I was there around spring, so it's all fresh and green. So I didn't smell anything. Yes.
He said it's like the arms and the fingers of people spreading out, trying to hold.
That's true, because all the roots of these trees do not go into the ground. They are all above the ground. So that's also what makes all these trees very fragile. So at some height, certain point, the tree would fall down, and then the moths would come and cover the entire trunk of the tree. And this is a place where also we realize how nature cycles itself without the interference of human beings. It's the perfect place just to, as an example, to see how it looks. But one of the downsides of this forest is Japanese people are afraid to go, because there is it's called yurei, which is the spirit, the ghost of the people who ended their lives in the forest, and are prohibited to leave the forest, and they are called yurei. And that's why usually it's not a destination for locals nor tourists. So if the tourists would go around, they would not enter the forest. They would just stay on the border of this forest. They wouldn't go in. And
you told me that after this visit, you're like, I went in not believing in ghosts, I came out less certain.
Yeah, so what happened is when I came back, because I photograph analog, not digital, So I took my films to the lab, and the lab didn't call me back, so I was really worried what happened. And then I called them, and they said, half of your images are destroyed. They destroyed the images in the lab. So I lost half of the shots I did in the forest after being there for 4 days. And then I recovered some of them, and I scanned the images, and I started to clean the images, to enlarge them like it's shown here. At some point, I started to realize there's this aberration of a color spectrum on each side of the image that appears. And then I started this. I mean, this is something never happened to me before. I've been taking pictures for 20 years with almost the same camera, same method, but this is the first time it happened to me, and then I just start worrying now. When we were installing the show with Sana, I told her to expect something wrong might happen while installing the show, so be aware.
I mean, spectral photography is a whole genre of photography. People have been trying to take pictures of ghosts for the longest time since camera exists, right? So you might have caught things.
Yeah.
I guess it's sort of a perfect sort of transition to one of the questions I had while sort of thinking about your practice, which is obviously photography could be considered one of the sort of ultimate sort of mediums of representation, and yet, and representation and figuration in many ways, but also, and yet you photograph the lack of. And this paradox for me is what makes your work so powerful. Can you tell me about this, about the paradox of using a camera, going to record a space, place, moment, personal story, historical moment, and yet when we face with the image, there's not much. Can you sort of tell me about that?
I think it's this notion that I use in these works, the absence of something, that's I think that's the main thing that triggers the image. Because if we look at these images in general, it's just normal trees or normal spaces, a bedroom or a swimming pool, but when you realize what is it about, I think that's where the mind starts to travel and try to explore more what's behind the wall, let's say.
So if the mind has to travel, then are you comfortable with metaphors? Because, for example, when you were talking about the fallen trees, you also think about fallen men. And so are you comfortable with metaphors? Are you comfortable with viewers and visitors having that kind of imagination and ways of reading your work?
I think yes, I am comfortable. I think for me that's because if I don't do it in this way, I would go more into documentary, where I just put bluntly everything in front of the viewer, and that would be really very difficult to absorb, especially with like topics such as disappearance or other like traumatic events people went through. I think it makes it even more difficult for people to read. They would kind of create this distance, or they would distance themselves from what's on the wall to look at. So, yeah.
One of the sort of common threads of the three projects you sort of showing here in Wolverhampton is another, for me, Western taboo, is grief and death and loss, and how we sort of process the loss of someone. And I wanted to ask you a question about this sort of idea, again, of using photography in order to process an emotion, or the sort of long time of emotion, such as grief. And sort of how do you connect those three projects to the idea of grief?
I mean, it's funny because when we had the conversation last week, I never considered grief as an element that exists in the work, but now looking back, and I start to realize that it's been always there. It might be not a personal one, but there is a sort of grief. I think it's also because the stories, what kind of stories they represent. So now I start to realize more and more that they are very visible, also present in these works. And I think the one that is really very vocal, it's the work that here is shown. It's Sweet and Sour, which is very personal work for me, and I think this is the first time I go that close to my personal stories. And I realized, this whole project is about grief, in a way for me. Yeah.
It's funny, on our sort of train up to Wolverhampton from London, we were making jokes about belonging to multiple cultures, having multiple languages, multiple passports, and I work mostly with people who sort of are in diaspora. And whilst I was reading about your work and looking at your pictures this week, I couldn't help but sort of think the thing that ties us all together is grief of something, of a homeland in some of your works, of lost people, of relationships, of
pain.
Yeah, and pain. Yeah. In many ways. And so you mentioned Sweet and Sour, which is one of your most personal projects. Do you want to maybe tell us a little bit more about it for people who haven't seen it yet?
So Sweet and Sour, it's the place in eastern Turkey where it was historical Armenia. I went back to this small village. It's called Hrair, which in Armenian means small apples. It's in eastern Turkey near Lake Van, and it's where my grandfather was born. And my grandfather was a survivor of the Armenian genocide, and he was married to a lady, and they had a son together. But when he escaped to Syria, he lost contact with his wife and son and the rest of the family. And I have similar story with my grandmother, who also was married to another person who she lost her two kids. They were thrown into the river by the Ottomans. This is during the Armenian genocide as well. And they later met in Aleppo, in Damascus, and they got married, and my father was one of their children. So my idea was to go back to this place because none of my grandfather could go back. I never met my grandfather, and nor my father went back because there was always the fear of going back to these places because on their minds is always afraid that they will kill them again. And so I went there without telling my family. My father didn't know, nor my mother. No one knew that I was there, and traveled in the region. I stayed with this family who were occupying houses of Armenians who used to live there. And it was a very tense experience for me because they were always following me. Even if I woke up at 4 a.m. in the morning, they would follow me because they thought that I am there just to look for treasures that was hidden by my grandparents. So they did not let me alone. So I filmed the region and the village, and I went back to Damascus after being away for 11 years because of the war. And I asked my father to sit in this room and to look at these images of the village where he came from, and I filmed his face. So we didn't have a conversation at the straight during the project, but later, after the film was finished, we discussed together. So for me, this is kind of fulfilling my father's dream to go there and to see the place, even though he couldn't go there physically. But for me, this was very personal thing also to be there, and it was very strange experience because when I was in the village, I was very tense. And I couldn't let my emotions go out because these people were always following and watching me constantly. So when after a few days, we went up on this top of the mountain. It's called Maruta, and Maruta is mentioned almost in every Armenian song from the region. And for us, it's a site of pilgrimage for Armenians from that region would go on top of the mountain. If they have someone sick in the family, they would bring an object that belonged to the person, and then they would drop it from the top to get rid of that sickness. So I went all the way up on the mountain, and then suddenly I just started crying and I couldn't hold myself. It just constantly. So that's why I filmed myself from the back while crying, where you could not see my face. So I tried to create this dialogue between the three of us, between my father and these images and me, giving my back to this conversation that they happen.
What you just said triggered two questions. Maybe one about time and how your work travels through time. You mentioned obviously the sort of Armenian genocide and the sort of family tree and how generations, sort of time of families and in that way, but also you switch from still photography to film, and that the idea of time then becomes obviously extremely important. And so I wanted to sort of, how do you engage with that idea of sort of generations, time stories, but also then how do you sort of work between still images? And also the film has moments where you're like, are we watching a still image, or are we into movement? There's this doubt about where we are in terms of movement. I'm quite interested in that sort of aspect of the work.
I mean, for me, the images in this film, they are all shot as still images. I mean, I used the video camera, obviously, and my intention was in each image to have something that moves, like a bird flying or a leaf is shaking, just to give this element of life that something is happening on the scene, but it looks like a still image. And the same thing it's with my father. I mean, I'm not a filmmaker, or I don't have any intention to make films or videos. And the way I used also the video camera, I use it as a still camera, because I couldn't see it differently. I just saw it as stills. Yeah.
There's something also, whilst you were describing you filming your own back whilst you were sort of crying on that mountain, there's also this idea of wanting to witness and at the same time withholding the witnessing. And I just wanted also to ask you about that notion of witnessing and where you sort of, on the spectrum of witnessing, where do you sort of situate yourself maybe?
It's funny because when I went to both villages, to my grandfather and my grandmother, it was not very emotional for me because everything was completely erased, especially my grandmother's side, because the entire village was completely erased. So it was really very strange to be there and knowing all these things that happened, that we grew up with, all these stories, and we carried them from day one we were born until now. And when I went there, they have done such a great job in erasing history that you would not, if you are someone going there without knowing the history, you would not even think that anything happened here. And this was very shocking for me and disturbing as well.
It's funny because, it's not funny, but it is sort of something I notice when I speak with Armenian friends. In the story there's always a mountain. The mountain feels like a motif of Armenian culture.
Yeah.
And I guess I want to ask you a question about storytelling and narrative and how we engage with stories. And I think in many ways, even if there's a lack of action or a lack of something happening in your pictures, in most of your project, yet there are very important stories, even if they're personal stories or sort of historical, sort of geopolitical stories. How do you feel about the sort of position of being a storyteller and a sort of someone who shares stories?
I mean, I don't claim I am a storyteller, but I'd like people to know what happens also elsewhere. I mean, not necessarily in Armenia, but for the Armenians, but also elsewhere. I think it's quite also important as an artist have this role also to spread out the message, let's say. I don't try to be activist, but I think it is important that we know what is also going around us, and in that sense, I think that's where I see myself as a storyteller. but not very. I don't see it like someone who is specialized in this, but it's a very simple way of, for me, it's to bring it to others so everybody also know what's happened across the world.
And for me, your stories, they often start with your titles, the titles of your sort of artworks. So here, Sea of Trees, Sweet and Sour, Last Scene. They're very sort of thoughtful. Could you sort of talk to us a little bit about what's behind those titles, and when do they come up, and when do you choose them? Do you have them from the beginning? Do you have to find them at the very last minute?
I mean, some of them I have it from the beginning, some of them during the process, and some of them also it comes later, and sometimes they don't come. But I always try to have this, to make a word game, a play with the wording of the titles. It kind of to connect it to the work without reading the text, let's say, of the description of the work, to give a hint at least what does it represent. For instance, Sweet and Sour, it came up when I was just wandering in this village. I realized a moment that some like apples or pears can be sweet, but if I eat them now, for me it will be very sour because of the meaning, and because of the story that my grandfather went through in this place. So it's always for one of my early works. It's called Execution Squares, and that one worked very well. I think that's what kept encouraging me to use these play words. It's when I realized when I was standing in front of these works, and people would not look at the photos, but once they start reading the title on the leaflet, they would go back and start looking for the hanged bodies, for instance, on these squares. And from here, I kind of took it as an element that is always important for my work.
And you also confuse people who you work with because you have last scene and last scene.
Yeah, I would never do that again.
I guess maybe going back to sort of my question about grief in a way, I kind of see a turning point in your work where you offer a glimpse of hope in your more recent work, which was less the case maybe in your earlier work. And I wanted to ask you about hope because I feel it's a very important emotion right now, and we need to hang on to hope. And for me, the sort of red ribbon in many ways is also an incredible symbol for hope. And there's maybe a sort of idea that hope might be a bit naive, but it's also, in my understanding of hope, a sort of radical position in not giving up. So, in a very sort of open, sort of ended way, I wanted to ask you about that shift. Am I making it up? Are you becoming more hopeful?
No, on the contrary, I'm becoming less hopeful, I think. And also, I'm just realizing if we keep sitting and hoping, I don't think things will change. And from that point, I don't see hope coming anytime soon. Which is very sad, but I think this is the reality too at the moment, which grows day by day.
Yeah. On this very sort of uplifting comment, I might open the floor to questions. Yes, because I can see this.
Yeah, I would just like to say,
Shall I record or?
in regards to hope, when you say that it's in the individual's mindset, because I've lost two brothers to suicide, and it happened in the same spot. Went to the same spot probably when my older brother passed away. So I'm just saying, I'm hopeful. I'm hoping for a better way, better day. And I do find with your work, it does open up people's minds, so there is hope there. That's how I see it.
I mean, I am not trying to bring hope with these works. I mean, it's more like let people see and I mean, it's a very good big compliment. Thank you. But I don't personally now, and I don't see hope. I'm really. It's not I'm someone skeptical. I am, but I don't see it coming soon.
But with your work, what I've seen for myself, I see it, and like going. I'm actually studying fine art myself, so I've actually moved forward from where my brothers were, and obviously some people can't feel in a box and they don't want to see beyond than a loved one passing away. But I see that there's hope. So I see hope in your work.
I'm the same. I see a shift, but
At the risk of contradicting you, I want to corroborate, reinforce what you were saying, because when I first saw your work, straight away I saw the healing power of forest, which is now quite fashionable in the West, but starting in Japan with the forest therapy, and that's what I thought about straight away. You know, I think the focus for me was, well, you can come out following the red ribbon. So maybe there is hope despite us.
Yeah, I think maybe it's also when it comes to work, maybe because I also dive so much into the work, and because I always have these dead ends, which blocks, and I think that's, for me, that's where I come from also. I mean, in Japan there are 33,000 people still every year. And it's really sad to hear this, but I mean, the government is not doing anything. I mean, it's been this for decades now, no? And it's really, and I mean, I went a couple of times. I've been reading not a lot about Japan, but because of this project, other project, and I just realized how life is really, although Japan is one of the most advanced countries, but for instance, they have so many different types of disappearing from society, going away, hiding, and this is really something, I mean, for me, shocking. So that's where I come from too.
I am. From what you're talking about, it feels to me that the work is very much about connections and how we're all connected together. And I wondered if, going into a work the way you do, are you trying to make a point, or are you more inviting people in to draw their interpretations from it?
I'm not trying to make a point. I'm trying to let people see and know and also to look. And I am not asking people to react, to take a stance, or it's more to have a knowledge of what's happening, you know, and to feel it. It doesn't cost us anything just to feel the others and feel their pains, and just to know. I think it helps to have a better place for everyone.
Have you exhibited your work in Japan?
I'm exhibiting my work in Japan, but a different work. Not this one yet.
Why is that?
One is new, and two, it's it just I can't call someone and say let's show it. You know, usually it works by invitation and this kind of ways. Yeah, but I'm planning to bring it.
Yeah, and my daughter lives in Japan, and she said why they do this is because they don't want to put their sorrows onto other people.
Correct, the burden.
Yeah, which is quite sad, isn't it? But that's their way of dealing with it, because they're all.
Yeah, but there is something human about it, that they don't want to put burden on the family because of the problems they have. They don't want to. I find it also like a fascinating gesture. There is no selfishness too.
Yeah, I've just come back from there. I do find those forests have got like a sense of eeriness, but yet they go out there and they welcome the forests by having weekends away, just lying in it, feeling the vibes.
Yeah.
So the forests have got two positives and a negative about it. I
Yeah, I mean, I know, for instance, the underground in Tokyo, they put these gates, and the reason they did this because people jump in front of these trains. And when they do that, the family pays a huge fine to clean. So they decided to do this, so, you know, it's to prevent these kind of things. It's yeah.
So you have to live in it to feel it, really, don't you? To be there, yeah.
I mean, I won't say I lived in the forest, but I walked through the forest for a few days. But and I also understood why people go to this because it's such a peaceful place.
Yeah.
And I mean, it can have two effects. It can have an effect that, okay, this is an amazing place, quiet, peaceful, I might reconsider. But also it can have the other effect, which is, this is the place where I want to be, there are no other people.
Because most people then want to be in nature, don't they?
Yeah.
That's why they go there.
Yeah.
But then this forest is probably different to the other one that's near where the stone monkeys are.
I don't know the other one.
Feel,
Yes.
it's feel, isn't it? Yeah. I think, you know. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's just a practical question really about how you did go about taking the photographs, and it sounds as if you have to go quite deep into the forest. Were you camping there, or were you going in and out each day? You had somebody supporting in terms of the equipment, because you've obviously got a lot of equipment to take along.
So I don't let anyone carry my equipment. I always do that, but with age now I have to. But I went with a guide who knew very well the forest, and Mount Fuji is a tourist guide for people who would want to hike Mount Fuji or nearby. And also there was a friend who joined me, who at the beginning refused to come because he was afraid of these spirits, but then he joined us, and then once we didn't camp in the forest, we stayed like in a hostel near the forest, so we had to go back and forth every day. Yeah.
There's a question over there too.
I know you mentioned you don't want to be activist, but with your work, the Armenian community can be the ambassador for somehow showing the photographer, because you visit West Armenia, isn't it? And West Armenia, everybody is nostalgic, and I think it's good to be work with the communities and the ambassador with your photograph seeking for justice.
You know, I don't. That's a big job for me.
Okay.
Realities are not simple, realities are very complex. And the idea that Japanese people go to die in the forest so they are not a burden on the families is sad. The idea of killing yourself, not to be a burden, is sad. And yet, if we visit any nursing home in this country and we see the very poor quality of life of very old people, I think that for myself, I have got the forest not in order to pass my money to my family, they can work for it, but in terms of quality of life and quality of death, I much rather go to this forest than to be sitting on a chair with my head lolling up and dragged and suffering. That's what I think.
So, I mean, talking about elderly people in Japan, elderly people usually when they retire, they kind of retreat from the society and even from their own family, and they go and live in the suburbs. And it's very common also to pass away in their home without knowing that the person is dead inside the apartment for a few months. It's very common. But here in the forest, it's more, it's usually like 40% of the people who go, they are male, age between 30 and 40. So it's more mental rather than, yeah. Yeah, and usually it's also, there's the other side of people who want to commit suicide that find it very difficult, very hard to commit such act. They decide to withdraw and disappear from the society and completely vanish. Because they find ending their life, they find it really very difficult, so they would decide to, which easier way is to disappear. And nobody would know where they are.
Thanks very much, Hrair. That was very interesting, thank you. I just wanted to offer two quick questions. One is about transgeneration or intergenerational trauma. You have grown up with dealing with the inheritance of what happened with the Armenian population, the Armenian genocide. You grew up in a country, a city where violence was used as a form of the exercise of power and control. Your work, Execution Squares, is about when people were executed in public. I wonder, I can't help but ask to what extent that has shaped your work, the subjects you choose to work on. Whether that's something you kind of think about consciously, or it's just implicitly what you have inherited and what you've dealt with growing up. Second very quick question, very different. What's happening in Syria now? How that's going to affect maybe what you might work on in the future? Are you interested in what's happening in Syria? How do you see that playing?
How it's going to reflect on my...
Yeah, the fact that there is political change happening in Syria, is that something you are interested in? Do you see that as opening up potential, revisiting Syria as a place to make work?
I mean, starting from the second question, at the moment I don't have any interest to go back. I mean, if I would go back, it would be because of my mother still living there and I want to go and see her. But as a curiosity to see, I think the only reason if I want to go back, it would be just to see the city. How does it look like without the posters of the previous dictator all around the country? How does it look like? But I was there in 2022, and the state that Damascus and the country was, it was very dreadful that you could see sadness. You wouldn't see people laughing on the street because it's really very difficult. Economically, it was really very bad. So I don't think anything has changed since then, and it will take at least few decades to stand up if they can stand up. I think that's also one of the things. Going back to the first question, I mean, all these traumatic things that I inherited from my family, they are present in my daily life, my thinking. I mean, even when I listen to Armenian music, I was saying yesterday to my friend Hrair, it's like, I just cry. And this is something we grew up with. It's kind of, our parents also not forced us like physically, but there's kind of a pressure on us to know what happened and to bring us up with these stories, because it also kind of shaped who we are now. And especially when we talk about Armenian diaspora, I think if we take away the Armenian genocide element from them, I think the whole community will kind of, there won't be any stronghold to stand on anymore.